There is a story the old wolves still tell when the wind cuts cold and the fire burns low. A story they do not tell lightly, and they do not tell it to those who cannot bear the weight of truth. They say that in the age before iron was shaped and before men built walls to keep the wild out, there lived a beast among the northern wolves so terrible that even the mountains seemed to lean away from him. His name was Gorak, and he was not merely large or merely strong. He was the kind of creature that the world makes only once, as if it frightens itself in the making and swears never to do it again. Every pack from the frozen river to the edge of the grey cliffs had bent their necks to him. Every alpha among men and wolves had looked into his golden eyes and looked away first. No one dared challenge the beast of the north, not the broad-shouldered chieftains who had fought bears with bare hands. Not the ancient wolf-blooded warriors who had held the mountain passes for generations. Not the shamans who spoke the old language and called fire from wet wood. No one. Because every soul who had ever considered it had seen what Gorak did to the last one who tried. And that memory was enough to keep a man's ambition quiet for the rest of his life. But then came a woman from the South Ridge, with ash in her hair and blood on her hands and something cold and unbreakable living behind her eyes. And she looked at Gorak the way no living creature ever had. She did not look away. Her name was Viel, and she was about to change everything that the wolves believed was permanent. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching this from, because people are coming to this story from places I never imagined, and I want to know where you are. I want to know that you are there, listening, because this story was made for you. The Northern Territory did not welcome the living with warmth, and it had never pretended otherwise. It was a land of pale sky and dark stone, where the trees grew twisted from years of wind that came without mercy and left without apology, where the ground was cold even in the belly of summer, and where the wolves who lived there were not the soft-furred creatures of gentler lands, but something older and harder, shaped by hunger and shadow into animals that moved like silence given teeth. The packs here did not howl for joy. They howled to remind the dark that they were still inside it, still alive, still watching. It was into this land that Viel came walking alone as the season turned from amber to grey. She came from the South Ridge, where her people, the Varek, had built their settlement against the base of a red rock cliff and spent 3 generations learning how to survive in a world that tested them without rest. The Varek were not large people. They were not famous for their warriors or their weapons. They were known, in the way that quiet, enduring people are known, for their steadiness, for the fact that they did not break easily, and for a certain quality in their eyes that strangers found difficult to name but never forgot once they had seen it. It was the look of people who had made peace with hard things. Viel had that look, and she had something more. She was tall for a woman of the Varek, with arms that carried the lean muscle of someone who had worked all her life without stop, with dark skin weathered by wind and sun, and with hair that she kept loose and that had gone prematurely grey at the temples, giving her the appearance of someone older than her years in the way that grief sometimes ages a person faster than time can. She carried a short spear, a worn hunting blade at her hip, and a bundle wrapped in cured hide across her back. She walked without hurry, but she also walked without rest, and the wolves who caught her scent on the wind did not come close, which was unusual because the northern wolves came close to everything that entered their land. if only to decide whether it was prey. Something in her scent said no. The first wolf settlement she came to was a small pack that held the edge of the birchwood, a group of 12 in their human skins, and perhaps 4 or 5 more who had not shifted back in seasons, who lived as wolves entirely now, and remembered the shape of humans only in dreams. The pack leader was a man named Duras, who wore the scars of many challenges across his chest and neck, and who stood at the edge of his territory and watched Viel approach with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether he needed to act. She stopped before she crossed the boundary, which told him she knew the rules. "I am Viel of the Varek," she said, and her voice was even, unhurried, carrying no apology in it and no performance of weakness. "I am passing through your territory toward the Gorak ground. I ask only for a passage. I will take nothing, leave nothing, and trouble no one." Duras looked at her for a long time, the way the wolf-blooded look at things, reading scent and stance and the 10,000 small signals that the body sends before the mouth opens. Then he said, "No one goes to the Gorak ground by choice." "I do," Viel said. "Then you are already dead," Duras said, "and I do not argue with the dead. Pass." She passed through his territory before midday and was gone into the deeper wood before his youngest wolves had finished debating among themselves what they had just witnessed. The older ones did not debate. They had seen something in her face that made the argument feel pointless. They went back to their fire and sat quietly, and more than one of them found themselves thinking about her hours later, and wondering what kind of loss a person has to survive before they stop fearing the worst thing in the world. Viel had survived the kind of loss that has no name. 3 seasons past, Gorak had come to the South Ridge. He had not come for war in the way that chieftains come for war, with declaration and ceremony and the formality of conflict. He had come the way a storm comes, without announcement, without negotiation, and with a completeness of destruction that left the survivors not angry. Or because anger requires a belief that things could have been otherwise, but simply emptied. He had demanded that the Varek people fold into his territory, that they give their young wolves to his pack, that their alpha submit before him in the old way, neck bared, head down, in the posture of total surrender. Their alpha had been Viel's father Heron, who was a gentleman in the way that only the truly strong can afford to be gentle. Our man who had led his people through 2 droughts and a sickness and had done it through patience and wisdom rather than force, and who had looked at Gorak and known immediately that there was nothing to negotiate. That Gorak did not want submission so much as he wanted to demonstrate that submission was possible. That he wanted Heron on his knees not because it helped him, but because it reduced Heron. Heron had said no. The word had barely finished forming in the air before Gorak moved. And what happened after that, Viel did not allow herself to remember in full, because the full memory was a thing that, if she looked at it directly, would stop her from putting one foot in front of the other, and she needed to keep walking. She kept it in pieces, in fragments she only glimpsed when her guard dropped, and even in fragments it was enough to hollow out her chest every time. She had survived because she had been in the wood when it happened, returning from a hunt. And she had heard it, and run toward it and arrived too late, and then been pulled away by 2 of the elder women who had loved her mother and who loved her and who were strong enough to hold her back and smart enough to know that if she went toward Gorak in that moment, she would simply be one more body for the ground to swallow. She had spent 3 seasons after that doing the only thing she knew how to do, She had prepared, not in the way of revenge, hot and blind and reckless. Because Viel had sat with her grief long enough to understand the difference between revenge and justice, and she had decided that what she wanted was not to feel better, but to be effective. Revenge was personal. What she was doing was not personal. It was necessary. Gorak would do to other people what he had done to the Varek. He was already doing it. And every pack that bent their neck to him made him larger, made the circle of his destruction wider, but made it more certain that other settlements would face what her settlement had faced. She had spent 3 seasons learning everything about him that could be learned without dying. She had spoken to survivors of other packs he had broken. She had spoken to the shamans who had studied him from a distance and who knew things about the wolf-blooded that ordinary people did not know. When she had hunted alone in difficult terrain until her body knew how to move through danger the way water knows how to move through stone, finding the path not by force but by persistence. She had practiced with her spear until it was no longer a tool she used, but an extension of what she intended. She had sat in the cold for long nights doing nothing, not meditating in any ceremonial sense, but simply teaching herself that discomfort was not the same as danger, and that a person who cannot sit with discomfort will flinch at the wrong moment. She had also spoken on the final night before she left to old Sefer, the eldest of the Varek women, who was so old that her age had become a kind of authority all by itself, who had known 5 alphas and outlasted them all. Sefer had taken Viel's face in her 2 hands, which were small and dry and carried the strength of old roots, and she had looked at her for a long moment without speaking. You know what you are going to, Sefer said finally. I know, Viel said. You know that no one has come back from it. I know that no one has come back from challenging him directly, Viel said. I am not planning to challenge him directly. Sefer's eyes moved over her face in the way that old women's eyes move when they are reading something more than the surface. What are you planning? I am planning to win, Viel said. Sefer had released her face and sat back and said nothing for a long time. And then she said quietly, as if she was telling a secret to the fire rather than to Viel, your mother had something in her that I never saw in anyone else. A kind of knowing that came from somewhere below thought. I used to wonder where she got it. She paused. I stopped wondering when you were born. Viel had left before first light the next morning, before anyone else was awake because she did not want a farewell. And she did not want anyone to follow. And she did not want to see the faces of people she loved arranged in the expression that people arrange their faces into when they are watching someone they may never see again. She walked north. She walked through the birchwood and through the grey stone pass and across the frozen shallows of the river that had no name because the people who might have named it had all moved south long ago to get away from what lived beyond it. She walked until the air changed and the silence changed, and she felt, in the back of her neck where the body keeps its oldest knowledge, the particular quality of a place where something very large and very dangerous considers itself the only thing that matters. She stopped at the edge of a wide clearing where the trees had been stripped bare of low branches, she thought at first by weather, and then she saw the claw marks in the bark and understood that it was not weather. She stood in the grey afternoon light, her breath a thin cloud, her spear across her back, her hand loose at her side, and she looked at the claw marks that went higher than any wolf she had ever heard of could reach. And she did not let the calculation she was doing show in her body, because she had already decided, before she ever left home, that she would not let fear have her body. Her mind could know what it knew, and her body would do what she needed it to do. She moved forward into the territory of Gorak, the beast of the north. And somewhere ahead of her, in the grey and the cold, something enormous raised its head from sleep and breathed in and knew that something had entered its ground that had not entered it before. Something that did not smell like prey. Something that smelled confusingly, almost impossibly, like purpose. The clearing that marked the true beginning of Gorak's territory was not like other places that powerful wolves claimed. Other alphas marked their ground with scent and with the signs that wolf-blooded people used to say, "This is mine, this is held, enter with your head low and your intentions clear." Those markings carried a kind of conversation in them, a negotiation between the one who claimed and the one who approached, a language that the wild world had used since the first wolf looked at the first stretch of land and felt something in its chest. Gorak's ground said nothing like that. It said, "Leave." The trees at the boundary were not marked with claw lines meant to be seen. They were broken, not snapped cleanly the way a falling wind snaps a branch, but torn, as if something had taken hold of them in a moment of casual displeasure and simply ended them, pulling wood apart the way a person tears soft bread, without effort and without particular attention. The stumps were old in some places and fresh in others, which meant that this destruction was not a single event but a habit, something that happened here regularly, in the way that a man might sharpen a blade against a stone, not because the blade needs sharpening in that moment, but because the motion itself satisfies something in him. Viel walked through it with her eyes moving and her breathing steady. She was tracking, and she was being tracked, and she knew both things simultaneously and kept moving anyway, because stopping would not have helped, and moving gave her information. She could feel the attention on her the way you can feel heat from a fire you cannot yet see, a change in the quality of the air, a pressure without a source. Whatever was watching her was not close enough yet to act, which meant it was curious enough to wait. And curiosity was information. Curiosity was something she could use. The ground was pale here, nearly white in patches, which she had been told about by one of the shamans she had visited. A small, precise woman named Obu, who had spent years studying the wolf-blooded from the safety of distance, and who had told Viel things that no one else had bothered to learn because no one else had wanted to get close enough to look. "His wolf form burns more than any wolf blood I have ever known," Obu had said, pulling at the loose skin of her chin the way she did when she was thinking hard. "It burns from the inside out, like a fire that has no fuel except his own will. The ground where he rests loses something. Plants do not grow back there for seasons. I have seen it in 3 of his den sites. White soil, lifeless, or as if the heat of what he is pulls something out of the earth and does not put it back." Viel had looked at the white ground beneath her feet now and understood that she was close to a place where he had rested often, which meant she was close to a place he considered safe, which meant she was close to a place he might come back to without his guard fully raised. She did not set up where she stood. She moved carefully around the white patch, keeping it on her left, and followed the line of broken trees northward for a time, reading the land the way her father had taught her to read it, not looking for one thing but letting the whole picture form slowly, the way an image forms in still water by not disturbing it. She found what she needed before dark. It was a shallow rise in the ground, stone-backed and sheltered on 3 sides by a natural curve of rock that had stood in this configuration since before any living memory. And it faced south, which meant it caught what little warmth the weak northern sun offered, and it was downwind of the white soil clearing by enough distance that her scent would not carry there directly unless the wind changed hard in the night. She was not planning to be there long enough for the wind to change twice. She built no fire. She ate cold from her pack, dried meat, and a small handful of the hard, flat bread the Varek made for long journeys. And she drank water from a skin she had filled at the last stream before the territory edge, because she did not know what the streams inside this ground would taste like, and she preferred not to find out. Then she sat with her back against the cold stone and did what she had practiced, which was to wait without the waiting eating her. It was not easy even now, even after 3 seasons of practicing it, because the mind does not enjoy waiting when the stakes are total. And Viel's mind was as alive as any mind, and it wanted very badly to be doing something, to be moving, to be making progress in some direction that felt like forward. She let it want that, and did not give it what it wanted. And after a time, the wanting settled into something quieter, something she could sit beside without being ruled by it. She thought about the things Obu had told her. Gorak had not always been what he was now, which was the first important thing. Then he had been born to a northern pack, wolf blood from both sides, which was not rare but was not common, and the combination of strong wolf blood from both parents sometimes produced what the shamans called a heavy shift, a wolf form that was larger and more consuming than either parent's, as if the 2 bloodlines competed for dominance in the child's body and both won, producing something that was too much of both rather than a balance of either. Heavy shifts were almost always male. Obu had said, and always devastating to the person who carried them, because the wolf was too strong and the man too weak to hold it back once the shift was full. And what they became in the full shift was not wolf-blooded in the way that most wolf-blood people were wolf-blooded, meaning human with something powerful running alongside, but something much more wolf than human, something that the human part could ride but could not steer. And that over years, Obu believed, Ha began to consume the human part altogether, the way a very large fire consumes the air around it until there is not enough air left for anything else to breathe. Gorak had been shifting to full wolf for longer than most wolf-blooded people lived, which means, Obu had said carefully, watching Viel's face, that what you would face is not a man who becomes a wolf. It is a wolf who sometimes wears a man, and who is losing even that. Viel had absorbed this without changing her expression. Or what does it need? She had asked. Not what he wants. What does the wolf need? Obu had looked at her for a long moment. Territory, she said. Challenge. The kind of challenge that makes the wolf feel the size of itself. He comes back to human form when he fights in human spaces, when the pack is watching, when there is ceremony to it, because the wolf in him wants the pack to see what it is. It wants witnesses. Viel had sat with that for a long time after leaving Obu's dwelling. A wolf that needed witnesses. A creature of enormous power that still required an audience, that still came partially back to human shape to be seen in its dominance, that still wanted something from the social world even as the social world was being consumed by the animal. That was the crack in the mountain, small and easy to miss, but there if you looked for it with the right kind of patience. She slept in pieces through the night, waking and listening, and then sleeping again. And in the coldest hour before dawn, she heard it for the first time, distant enough that she might have mistaken it for wind in another life, before she had learned to distinguish between the sounds the world makes and the sounds that something in the world makes. It was breathing. Not the breathing of something asleep or resting, but the breathing of something that moved, slow and heavy and deliberate. The kind of breathing that belongs to a body of enormous mass that is not in any hurry and has never needed to be, that moves through its world with the absolute confidence of a thing that has never once been the prey in any encounter it has had. She did not move. She sat against her cold stone and listened and measured, the way Obu had told her, using the sound to build a picture, estimating from the heaviness of each breath the size of the chest that produced it, estimating from the interval between breaths the pace of movement, estimating from the direction of the sound the line of travel. It was moving parallel to her position, not toward her, which meant either that it had not caught her scent, or that it had caught her scent and was not yet interested enough to turn toward it. She had done something before she entered the territory that Obu had suggested, and that had seemed strange at the time, and seemed less strange now. She had spent the last day of her approach walking through stands of a particular grey-leafed plant that grew on the northern slopes, a plant that the wolves of this land used as a boundary marker, pressing it against her skin and her clothing until the scent of it was in her, not masking her human scent, but layering over it, mixing with it, making her smell like something that belonged in this landscape rather than something that had wandered into it. It was not a trick that would hold under close attention, but it might hold long enough for her first few days, long enough to observe without being immediately driven out. And observation was what she needed more than anything else right now. The breathing moved past and faded northward. Viel let out a breath she had not fully realized she was holding, and she sat in the cold grey, almost dawn, and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was in it now, fully in it. That the calculating and the preparing were finished, and the actual living through it had begun, and that everything from this point forward would require her to be exactly what she had spent 3 seasons building herself to be. She waited for full light before she moved. The second day inside the territory she spent in motion, careful and wide-ranging, mapping the ground the way a hunter maps unfamiliar territory before committing to a position, learning the clearings and the water and the places where the white soil spread and the places where the trees were whole, building a picture of the land that she could close her eyes and navigate. She found his den on the second afternoon. She smelled it before she saw it, and she stopped and did not go closer, standing at what she judged to be the edge of the radius where a sleeping wolf would catch her scent. And she looked at what she could see from that distance, and she made herself be honest about what she was seeing. The entrance was split in a stone face wide enough to admit something very large, and the ground before it was white and bare, and the stone around the entrance was scored with the marks of repeated passage, deep lines worn by the friction of a body too large to pass through the gap without contact. The bones at the periphery were not the bones of small animals. They were large bones, elk and something larger than elk, and they were old and new in layers, years of feeding in one place. She stood and looked at it, and let the reality of what she was doing arrive in her fully, without flinching away from it, because she had learned that flinching away from a hard truth only delayed the moment when you had to face it, and added fear to the facing. Then she turned and walked back to her position, and sat down, and began planning in earnest. Because she had seen enough. She had learned enough. And the window she was waiting for required precise timing, and she could not afford to wait long enough for something to go wrong in the waiting. She pulled her spear from its place across her back, and laid it across her knees and ran her thumb along the edge of the shaped stone head, feeling the sharpness of it the way you check on something you have spent a long time making and need to trust completely. It held its edge. She looked north, where the den sat in the stone, where something the size of a collapsed sky slept and breathed and owned everything it could see. And she thought about her father, and she thought about Sepha's hands on her face, and she thought about the Varek people sitting in the shadow of the red rock cliff, waiting for a world that did not have Gorak in it. And then she stopped thinking about all of it and let her mind go clean and empty and ready. Tomorrow, she will make herself known. She chose the hour carefully. Not dawn, when a wolf was most alert, senses sharpened by the long night's quiet, into something close to perfect. Every sound and scent arriving at a nervous system that had spent hours in the dark, growing more sensitive with each passing moment. Not dusk either, when the light changed and the wolf-blooded felt the pull of the shift most strongly, when the animal in the blood rose toward the fading sun the way water rises in a reed. She chose midday. The grey northern midday that was less a brightness and more a general lessening of dark, when the cold was at its most settled, and the particular flatness of the light suggested stillness rather than movement. She walked to the edge of his den clearing, and she stopped at the boundary where the white soil began, and she waited. She stood with her spear held vertically at her right side, not raised, not presented as a weapon but visible, not hidden behind her body or tucked away as if she wanted to seem unarmed. She had thought carefully about how to hold it and had decided that concealment was the wrong message. She was not here to deceive. She was here to be seen, and she wanted to be seen as she actually was, which was a person who carried a weapon and was not afraid to let that be known. She waited. She had calculated, based on 2 days of listening and mapping, that he would smell her within a very short time from this position, because the wind in the midday hours moved southward through this clearing in a slow, consistent pull, carrying everything from the northern stone face toward the tree line where she stood, which meant her scent would carry toward the den rather than away from it. She was right about the timing. She heard movement inside the den before she saw anything. The shift of great weight on stone. A sound like boulders deciding to rearrange themselves, slow and unhurried, and carrying in it the sense of something waking, not because it was disturbed, but because it had caught something interesting and had decided to investigate the interesting thing at its own pace. In its own time. Then he appeared. He came through the split in the stone in his human shape, which surprised her because she had half expected the wolf, had prepared herself for the wolf, and the human shape was in some ways harder to look at because the human shape could speak and the human shape made what she was doing feel more immediate, more real, more like something that was actually happening to an actual person, rather than a confrontation with a force of nature that had no face. He was enormous in his human shape. She had known he would be, because the heavy shift produced large human forms as well as large wolf forms. Oh, but knowing a thing and standing before it were different experiences, and she let herself absorb the difference without pretending it was not there. He was taller than any man she had seen by more than a full head, and his breadth at the shoulder was something her mind kept trying to normalize and failing, because there was no normal to compare it to. His hair was pale and long and tangled with what looked like the remnants of an old binding that had long since stopped serving its purpose, while his skin had the weathered, almost grey quality of someone who lived entirely outside in cold air for years. His eyes were the golden amber of wolf eyes in human faces, but they were brighter than they should have been, burning with a quality of light that was not reflective because there was not enough midday sun here to reflect. He looked at her from the den entrance without moving, standing in the scored gap of stone like something that the mountain had made and then regretted and tried to push back inside. The silence between them was long. He was the one who broke it, and his voice when it came was low and rough with disuse. Not the voice of a man who spoke regularly, but of one who had let the human habit of speech go mostly idle, the way a muscle goes stiff when it is not used. "You are very small," he said, to be standing where you are standing." "I am the right size for what I am doing," Viel said. His head moved slightly, the slow tilt of an animal reading an unexpected signal. He had expected, she thought, fear. He received everything that was not fear, and the novelty of it was making him pause. "What are you doing?" he said. It was not a question in the way of someone who wanted an answer. See, it was a question in the way of someone who was genuinely puzzled and was not accustomed to genuine puzzlement, who lived in a world so thoroughly comprehensible because he had made it comprehensible through the simple mechanism of destroying anything he did not understand. "I came to see you," Viel said. "You came to see me," he repeated, and something in his voice shifted, something that she thought was not quite amusement, but was the ancient, a corroded remnant of what amusement had once been in him before most of the human had burned away. "I came to see Gorak," she said, holding the name level, not weaponizing it, not using it as a challenge, just placing it in the air between them the way you place something on a table to show that you are not hiding it. "I wanted to know what he was before I decided what to do about him." The ancient remnant of amusement left his voice entirely. He stepped forward off the scored stone onto the white soil, and the movement was slow and had a weight to it that the ground seemed to register. And he stood now in the open clearing and looked at her with the full force of the golden eyes, which was something that she had been told about and had believed she understood and discovered she had not understood fully until this exact moment, because there was a physical quality to being looked at by him, a pressure, as if his attention had mass, as if being seen by him was something the body had to work against. She stood in it and did not step back. "You are Varek," he said. He said it with certainty, not asking. "I am," she said. "The South Ridge people," he said. Something moved across his face. Not emotion exactly, but the place where emotion used to live. The geography of a feeling that no longer fully arrived. "I was there." "I know," Viel said. "I was there too." He looked at her and she could see him placing it, reaching back through the vast catalogue of places and people he had consumed, finding the South Ridge and what he had done there, and something she had not expected happened, which was that he found it without difficulty, which meant he remembered it, which meant it had not been simply one of dozens of identical moments to him, but something he had retained. And she filed that information away immediately because information was the only real weapon she had, and she intended to use every piece of it. "You came back to me," he said. "I came north," she said. "You are in the north." "They are the same thing," he said, and took another step toward her, and she held her position, and the distance between them was now close enough that she could hear him breathing, could feel the heat that Obu had described, a warmth that radiated off him in the cold air like a stone that has been in the sun all day and holds the heat into the night. "Why does a dead woman walk into my territory and stand at my door?" he said. And there was no cruelty in the way he said it, and that was in some ways more frightening than cruelty would have been, because cruelty implies that a thing matters enough to make you want to hurt it, and his voice implied something more total, a simple, her patient certainty that she was already a concluded event, and that the only remaining question was when the conclusion would manifest. "Because I have a proposition," Viel said. The golden eyes did not change. "I do not accept propositions." "You have never had one worth accepting," she said. "This one is." The silence stretched, and the cold sat in it, and the white ground lay bare between them, and somewhere in the trees a bird called once and did not call again. "Speak," he said finally, and the single word carried in it something she had hoped for, the faintest, nearly imperceptible lean of a creature that was so bored by its own power that novelty, however small, still moved it. She had prepared for this moment with the same care she had prepared for everything, turning it over in the long nights until she knew every angle of it, until she could speak without hesitation or performance, because hesitation and performance were things he would see through instantly, and she needed the words to arrive with the same quality as everything else about her, which was that they were exactly what they appeared to be, and nothing else. "The pacts you have broken," she said, "do not serve you. They fear you, which is not the same thing. A pack that serves from fear serves only while the fear is fresh, and fear goes stale the way meat goes stale, and what is left is not loyalty but rot." She paused, not for effect, but because the next part needed space around it. "You have made yourself the largest thing in this territory, and you have nothing to show for it but broken things." Something moved in his face, something deeper than the surface, something that she thought might be the last remaining fragment of the man underneath the wolf, stirred by the specific quality of what she had said, which was that it was true, which was something he had perhaps not heard in a very long time, because the things people say to overwhelming power are almost never true. "I know something," she continued, steady and level, "about what a pack should be, and about what a territory held by strength and by true loyalty rather than by terror can produce. I know this because my people built it for 3 generations in the shadow of the Red Rock Cliff. I came here to offer you that knowledge because the alternative is that your territory continues to be a collection of frightened, broken things that will fail you the moment they find a reason to believe you can be failed. And that moment is coming sooner than you think." The golden eyes held her for a very long time. "And what," he said, "do you want in exchange for this knowledge?" "I want to live among the packs you hold," she said, "as a speaker between you and them, a voice that carries clearly in both directions. I want the packs to have a way to bring their needs to you that does not require them to approach you directly, because approaching you directly destroys the thing you need from them, which is their functioning." He was quiet for so long that the bird called again somewhere in the woods, twice now, and fell quiet. "You want to be useful to me," he said, and this time there was something in his voice that she could not quite name. Something that was testing the idea the way you test ice before you put your weight on it. "I want to be necessary to you," she said. "Useful things can be discarded. Necessary things are kept." The golden eyes moved over her face one more time, the full weight of that attention, and she stood in it the way she had stood in every hard thing she had taught herself to stand in. "You will sleep at the boundary of my ground," he said, "not inside. You will come to me each morning at the clearing. You will speak, and I will listen or I will not. And if what you say is not worth my listening, you will leave and not come back." "Agreed," she said, and she said it without relief in her voice, without gratitude, because relief and gratitude were the postures of someone who had not expected to get this far, and she needed him to believe that she had always expected exactly this. Because the moment he suspected her of desperation was the moment she became just another thing he was deciding how to end. She turned and walked back toward the tree line without hurrying, without looking back, and the cold air pressed against her from the north and the white ground lay silent behind her, and she breathed carefully and kept her spine straight and her stride even. Behind her she felt the golden eyes watching her go, and in the weight of that watching she found, carefully, so carefully, the first thin outline of what she had come here to build. Not an escape, not a survival, a position. And from a position everything was possible. She kept her word precisely, because precision was the only currency she had. Each morning before the light had fully committed to being light, she rose from her place at the territory boundary where she had built a small shelter from cut branches and packed earth, functional and without comfort. And she walked to the clearing before the stone face, and she stood where she had stood on the first day, and she waited for him to come out. And she was always there before he appeared, which was a thing she did deliberately, because she understood that a person who is always already present when the powerful one arrives sends a message that requires no words, which is that they do not scramble, they do not rush, they simply are where they said they would be, already, always. Gorak noticed this, she believed, though he said nothing about it. The first week of mornings was mostly silent. He would come through the stone gap and stand in the clearing and look at her, and she would speak, telling him what she had observed about the packs at the edge of his territory, what she had learned in the days before she entered his ground, what she understood about the tensions between the pack that held the birchwood, Duras's pack, more on the smaller group that had tried to establish itself just north of them and had been pushed into an uncomfortable position between Duras's boundary and Gorak's, too afraid to press north and too compressed to function properly in the space they had been left. She did not tell him what he should do about it. She told him what it was, cleanly and without decoration. And then she stopped talking, and he stood in the clearing and breathed the cold air and said nothing, and then went back inside. And she walked back to her shelter and ate and rested, and went out in the afternoon to continue observing, because she could not report what she did not know, and she needed to know more every day than she had known the day before. On the fourth day, he said, after she had finished speaking, "The group north of Duras is dying." "Yes," she said. "I did not intend for them to die," he said, and it was such a naked sentence, so devoid of justification or apology, simply a statement of a fact about his own intentions delivered without any of the covering language that people usually lay over admissions like this, that she had to work to keep the surprise out of her face, not because it undermined anything she believed, but because she had not expected him to reach that far into his human self this soon. "They will die unless the boundary between them and Duras is redrawn," she said. "Or unless they are folded into Duras's pack with terms that preserve their elders' standing. A full absorption with no terms will collapse them faster than the territory pressure, because the elder of that group is the last thing holding them together, and a forced absorption that takes his standing from him takes the thread out of the weaving." Gorak was quiet for a moment. "You know this from looking at them for how long?" 2 days, she said. He looked at her with the golden eyes in the way she was beginning to be able to read. Not fully, not with certainty, but well enough to sense the difference between the look that meant he was deciding whether she was worth the continued attention, and the look that meant something she had said had found something real in him, and he was sitting with it. This was the second look. "Go to the elders," he said. "Tell him that the ground north of Duras is his and his people's to hold without interference, and that he owes me 6 young wolves to train in the season of new growth. Not as servants, as trained wolves who know how to hold a northern boundary." She went. It took her the better part of a day to reach the compressed pack's position at the edge of the pressure zone, and she arrived to find them in the condition she had expected, thin and watchful and arranged in the particular way of people who have been afraid for long enough that they have stopped showing it because the showing had become exhausting, and only the shape of their bodies against the landscape gave it away. The way they all faced slightly outward, even when they were talking to each other, the way the children stayed close to the centre. The elder's name was Breck, and he was perhaps 50 years old and looked older, nor a narrow man with a wolf's stillness and a human's exhausted eyes, and he received her with the formal courtesy of someone who had been raised to treat guests correctly and had not yet been broken enough to stop. She told him what Gorak had said. She told him word for word, making nothing softer, making nothing harder, because she had decided from the first moment of this role that she would carry messages exactly as they were given to her in both directions, or that she would be a clear vessel rather than an interpretive one, because the value she offered Gorak and the value she offered the packs both depended on the same thing, which was that what she said could be trusted absolutely. Breck was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "Why would he offer this?" "Because it is more useful to him than your deaths," she said. "Aye, and because 6 trained boundary wolves in the season of new growth are worth more to a territory this size than the satisfaction of watching a pack collapse." Breck looked at her steadily for a moment. "You are Varek." "I am." "He destroyed the Varek settlement 3 seasons past," Breck said, and he said it not as an accusation but as a fact placed carefully in the space between them, waiting to see what she would do with it. "He did," she said, and she held the words level, and she did not add anything to them, because anything she added would be either a lie or a wound, and she could afford neither. Breck looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "What are you doing, Varek, woman?" "What needs to be done?" she said. He accepted the terms. She carried the acceptance back to Gorak the next morning, and something shifted again in the space between them in the clearing, something very small and very significant. The way a door that has been sealed for years shifts when someone finally applies consistent pressure to it, not opening, not even close to opening, but settling differently in its frame, acknowledging the pressure. This was how the weeks went. She moved between him and the packs like water moves between stones, finding the channels, keeping the current flowing, and she was careful always to remain the channel and not become the current, all to keep herself distinct from the message so that no one confused her own purposes with the purposes she was facilitating. She was building something, and she was building it in the only way she knew how to build things in difficult terrain, which was slowly and from the ground up, and without letting anyone see the full shape of what she was building until it was already built. Gorak, for his part, was changing in ways that she watched very carefully. He spoke more. Not much more, but measurably more, and the speaking was different in quality from those first rough, disused words, as if the practice of it was warming something that had been cold and stiff for a long time, working feeling back into it the way you work feeling back into a frozen hand, slowly and with some pain. He asked her questions sometimes, direct and without preamble, about things she had told him, following a thread she had laid down days earlier, which told her that he was thinking about what she said in the intervals between their conversations, turning it over in whatever part of him was still capable of turning things over. He asked her once in the third week, without looking directly at her, which she had noticed was how he asked the questions that mattered to him. "What did your father do to hold the Varek together?" She was quiet for a moment, not from pain, though the pain was there, but from the need to answer the question accurately rather than emotionally. "He listened more than he spoke," she said. "He knew the difference between a problem that needed solving and a person who needed to be heard. And he knew that sometimes those were the same thing and sometimes they were not, and he could tell which was which." She paused. "He also never asked anyone to do something he was not willing to do himself, not as a performance. So he just understood that the gap between what a leader asks and what a leader does is where trust falls into." Gorak said nothing for a moment. Then, "He challenged me." "He said no to you," Viel said carefully. "That is not the same as a challenge." The golden eyes moved to her face slowly. He knew what would happen. He knew what would happen, she agreed. And her voice stayed level and she looked back at him without blinking, and the space between her words and her feelings was the thinnest it had ever been, thin as the skin of ice over deep water. And she held it, held herself exactly where she needed to be, because this was not the moment. The moment was coming, but it was not here yet, and she could not let grief make her move before she was ready. "He was a fool," Gorak said, and there was no cruelty in it. Simply the flat assessment of a creature who had lived entirely by the rule that power wins, and that anything which put itself in front of power without sufficient power of its own was, by definition, foolish. "He was my father," Viel said, and she let those 4 words carry everything they carried and did not try to contain them, because she was not going to pretend to Gorak or to herself that she was made of something that did not grieve, and because she thought, she believed, that the fragment of human left in him would respond to what was true in ways it would not respond to what was performed. Something moved across his face. It was so quick she might have missed it if she had not been watching him for weeks with the focused attention she brought to everything, but she saw it. A flash of something in the burning amber eyes. Something that arrived and was gone in less than a heartbeat. Something that the wolf in him could not quite suppress in the moment she gave it something real to land on. He turned and went back into the den without speaking. She stood in the clearing and breathed the cold air and let herself shake, just slightly, just for a moment, with the particular trembling that the body does when it has been held very tightly for a long time and is given one small moment of release, and then she stopped shaking and straightened and walked back toward the tree line. She had 4 more things she needed to do before she was ready. The first was to establish through her regular visits to the packs exactly how many wolves in Gorak's territory would stand if the moment required standing, who among the pack alphas had enough wolf blood loyalty to their own people that they would move when they saw the thing she was going to show them, who was still enough of an alpha to choose when choice was made available. This she had been mapping since the beginning, or adding to the picture every day, and she was almost finished. The second was to understand his wolf form with a specificity she did not yet have, because Obu had given her the theory, and the theory was essential, but it was not the same as knowledge built from proximity, and she had been observing carefully, tracking the signs of his shifting in the marks left on the land and the patterns of his movement as she read them, and she needed 2 more days of this to feel confident. The 3rd was to choose the ground. The 4th was to be certain. Not certain that she would win, because she was not capable of being certain of that, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, and certainty of outcome was not what she needed. She needed to be certain that she was doing the right thing, that what she was about to do was not a wound she was inflicting on the world in the name of a wound inflicted on her, that it was actually what she believed it was. Which was the necessary thing? The thing that needed doing regardless of what it cost, the thing her father would have recognized even if he might have found another way to do it. She spent the night before she was ready sitting at her shelter with her spear across her knees and her eyes open, and she thought about every person she had spoken to in 3 seasons of preparation. And she thought about the broken packs. And she thought about Breck's eyes when she delivered terms that gave his people back enough ground to survive. And she thought about what Obu had said about the wolf that was consuming the man and what would be left when the consumption was complete. And she thought about what a territory that had nothing at its centre but an empty, burning animal would look like in 10 more seasons, in 20. And she thought about her father, not in pieces the way she usually thought about him, but whole. Or the whole of him, the way he walked, the way he listened, the way he looked at her sometimes across a fire with an expression that said, "I see you, all of you. And I am not afraid of any of it." By the time the grey light came, she was certain. She rose and took her spear and did not go to the clearing. She went instead to the place she had chosen 3 days ago and prepared 2 days ago and returned to yesterday to check, a broad, flat stretch of open ground north of the white soil clearing where the stone face gave way to a natural amphitheatre of low rock, open to the sky and visible from 4 directions, the kind of ground that the old wolf-blooded cultures had used for the great challenges, the formal contests of dominance that predated Gorak and would outlast him, grounds where witnesses could stand and see, and where what happened would be seen, where it would be witnessed. She built a small fire at the centre of the flat ground, using dry wood that would burn clearly and produce a column of smoke in the cold morning air that would be visible from the territory boundary in every direction. Then she stood beside it and she waited, and the smoke rose straight and thin into the pale sky, and the cold wrapped around her, and she was ready. The smoke brought the wolves before it brought Gorak. They came in 1s and 2s and then in clusters, stepping out of the tree line on all sides of the flat ground, with the careful alertness of wild things entering a space that carries significance, that smells of old power and old decision in the way that certain ground does when it has held enough weight over enough years. Some came in human form with wolf eyes, moving over everything. Some came partially shifted, are caught between shapes the way you are caught between sleeping and waking, not fully one or the other, held in the middle by the tension of a moment they could feel, but not yet named. Breck came, and beside him 3 of the young wolves of his pack, and he stood at the eastern edge of the flat ground and looked at Viel across the fire, and she met his eyes and he understood something in that meeting, and he stayed. Duras came from the south, alone, walking with the deliberate stride of an alpha who moves into uncertain territory and intends to let the territory know he is not uncertain. And he stopped at the edge and looked at her, and looked at the fire, and looked at the gathering wolves and said, loudly enough for those near him to hear, "What is this?" "A challenge ground," she said, and her voice carried cleanly in the cold air. Duras looked at her for a long moment. "You." "Me," she said, He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite the opposite of one, and he crossed his arms and stayed where he was, which was enough, which was all she needed from him at that moment. More wolves came, drawn by the smoke and by whatever it is that moves through a territory like a current when something is happening that has not happened before. That ripple of collective sensing that the wolf-blooded felt more keenly than ordinary people. The knowledge that something was tilting, more that a balance was shifting, that the world was in the process of becoming different from what it had been. By the time Gorak appeared at the northern edge of the flat ground, there were perhaps 40 wolves watching. He had come in his human shape, which she had expected, because the smoke and the fire and the gathering witnesses had done exactly what she had needed them to do, which was to call the human part of him forward, to tell the wolf in the language the wolf understood, and which was the language of pack and territory and dominance, that something requiring the human was happening, that there was a social event in progress that required the version of him that could be seen and named and testified to. He stood at the edge of the flat ground, and he looked at her across the fire and the watching wolves, and his golden eyes took in all of it, the gathering, the fire, the smoke, the position of her body, the spear in her hand no longer across her back but held, and she watched him understand what he was standing in. His voice, when it came, was the roughest she had heard it. "What have you done?" he said. "I have made a challenge ground," she said, and she let the words be simple because they were simple. "I challenge you, Gorak. Here, now, before witnesses." The silence across the flat ground was the heaviest kind of silence. The kind that arrives when 40 people stop breathing at the same moment because the thing happening before them is a thing they have told themselves was not possible, and the impossibility of it arriving in reality short-circuits the ordinary sounds that living bodies make. Duras made a sound, short and sharp. Gorak looked at her across the fire, and the burning amber of his eyes was something she stood inside of and did not step back from, and she could see the wolf rising in him. She could see it in the brightening of the gold, and in the slight change in his breathing, the deepening of it, the way it slowed and became more deliberate the way a fire slows when it is fed something large. "You have been building to this," he said, and it was not a question. "From the beginning," she said. "The knowledge you offered me," he said. "The packs, the messages, all of it, she said. "Why, I needed to know the ground, and I needed witnesses, and I needed you to come out in a human shape for long enough that the human in you could be present for what happens here. A wolf that has no human left cannot be challenged in a way that the packs will carry forward. What is done here today needs to mean something. It needs to be something that every wolf standing on this ground can look at and understand and remember and tell." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the processing happening in him, the last remaining human intelligence working through what she had laid before him. And then he said something she had not expected. "You knew I would not kill you in the mornings," he said. "You knew that what you were giving me would keep you alive long enough to do this." "I believed it would," she said. "I did not know. And if you had been wrong, then I would have been dead sooner than this and the packs would still be broken," she said. "But I was not wrong." He took a step forward onto the flat ground, and the temperature seemed to drop, and the wolves at the perimeter shifted and tightened, and she could hear behind her the sound of some of them pressing back, not fleeing, but pressing back, making space between themselves and what was moving toward the center of the ground. "You cannot win this," he said, and there was nothing of cruelty in it still, only the certainty that she had heard from him on the very first day. The flat and total confidence of a thing that has never lost. And she thought about what that was, what it felt like inside, never to have lost. And she thought it must be a kind of poverty, a vast and silent poverty, because losing taught things that nothing else taught, and a creature that had never lost had never learned what losing taught. She had lost before. She had lost the most important thing she had, and she was standing here. "I am going to try anyway," she said, and she raised her spear. He shifted. She had prepared herself for this, had spent 2 days in the final week observing the signs of his shifts in the land, and had listened to Obu's careful description, and had built in her mind the most accurate picture she could of what it would look like. But the preparation was like building a picture of fire from someone's description of heat. It gave you the concept and failed to give you the experience. And the experience of Gorak's shift was something that struck the body before the mind had finished registering what was happening. It was not slow as she had feared. It was very fast, and it was enormous, not the smooth, continuous transformation that some wolf-blooded managed, but a violent unfolding, as if something contained at enormous pressure had been given sudden permission to expand, and the body she had been looking at across the fire was suddenly, in the space of a few heartbeats, not the body she had been looking at, but something else, something that made the flat ground feel smaller by its presence, the way a mountain makes the valley feel smaller, not by filling it, but simply by existing at the edge of it. The wolf that stood in the centre of the challenge ground was ash-pale and massive, and the ground under him was white within moments where the heat of him touched it, and his eyes were 2 burning points of gold in the pale, heavy face, and he was looking at her. Behind her she heard 2 of the younger wolves break and run. She did not look back. She planted her feet in the cold ground, and she held the spear and she looked at him, and she thought about the crack in the mountain, that thin line she had been pressing against for weeks, and she thought about what Obu had told her about heavy shifts, the one piece of knowledge she had kept closest, the one piece she had built every other piece around. The heavy shift burns from the inside, Obu had said. It is not sustainable at full extension. No wolf in a heavy shift can hold the full form longer than a certain period before the energy requirement becomes unsustainable and the form begins to collapse back toward humans. The wolf knows this, and the wolf in a heavy shift will always try to end a fight quickly, because a prolonged fight risks the form failing at the worst moment. He would try to end this quickly. She could not win a quick ending. She needed to survive long enough for the form to become a cost. He came at her, and she moved, not toward him and not directly away, but at an angle. The angle she had chosen before she ever lit the fire. The angle that took her around his left side toward the stone curve at the eastern edge of the flat ground. The curve she had spent an afternoon studying and measuring against what she knew of his size. And she moved faster than she had ever moved in practice because fear is an accelerant when you have trained it to serve you rather than rule you. And she made the eastern edge with a body length to spare and put the stone at her back. The stone curve was important for 2 reasons. The first was that it prevented him from getting behind her, which would have ended things immediately. The second was that it forced him to come at her from a narrower angle than he preferred, which slowed him, but not by much, but by enough. And in a fight where the measurement of time was the measurement of survival, enough was everything. He struck at her twice, and she took the second one across her left arm, not the claws but the force of the moving limb, and it threw her sideways along the stone wall, and she hit hard and tasted blood in her mouth and went back to her feet before she had fully processed the impact, because she had practiced falling too. Saad had practiced rising from falls until the rising was faster than the thinking. She heard the wolves at the perimeter, not the sounds of fear, something else, something that had started as held breath and was becoming something louder, something that grew each time she moved and did not fall finally. Something she recognized from the stories the shamans told of the old challenge grounds, of the time before Gorak, of the thing that happens in a wolf pack when the watching ones begin to believe that the thing they thought was impossible might not be. She planted the spear. She had one moment, one gap in the form's movement, and she had been waiting for it since the fight began, waiting for the specific instant that Obu had described, the brief hesitation that came when the heavy shift recalculated, when the enormous body checked itself against its own energy cost, and she had felt it in his last strike, felt the fractional pause at the apex of the movement, the half-heartbeat where the form was between intentions. She put the spear into that half-heartbeat with everything she had, with 3 seasons of grief and preparation, and cold mornings standing in clearings, and the whole weight of every person she had ever loved looking at her and believing she would not fail them. The spear found what it needed to find, and then there was a sound, and then there was silence, and then the ground. How the ground received everything. Viel stood in the silence that followed and breathed, and the air came in and went out in ragged pulls, and the blood from her arm dripped onto the white soil and turned it red, and around her on the flat ground, the wolves stood without moving, without sound, and she could feel 40 pairs of eyes and the weight of 40 held breaths and the particular quality of a world that is in the process of understanding that it has changed. She looked down at what lay on the challenge ground. Then she looked up at the wolves, and she did what she had come to do. She did not rush the moment. She understood, in the way that people understand things that arrive below thought and settle directly in the body, that this moment did not belong only to her, that it belonged to every wolf standing on the flat ground, and to every broken pack across this territory, and to every person who had bent their neck to Gorak and felt the particular shame of a submission that was not chosen but taken from them. And a moment belonging to that many people required the space its weight demanded. She reached down. She took hold of what needed to be held. She rose to her full height, and she turned to face the wolves of the Northern Territory, and she held Gorak's head before them, not as cruelty, and not as the display of a conqueror wanting the defeated to know how completely they have been defeated. She held it the way the old challenge traditions required, in the open, in the clear air, hard before witnesses so that every eye on the flat ground could confirm what they had seen and carry it forward as testimony that no future fear or doubt could hollow out. Because 40 wolves had stood on this ground and looked with their own eyes and knew. The silence held for a long time. Then Duras made a sound. It began low in his chest, below language and below ceremony, in the place where the wolf-blooded carried the old sounds, the ones that predated words and would outlast them. And it rose from him slowly the way smoke rises from new wood, finding its shape as it went. And it was not a howl of celebration and not a howl of mourning, but something older than either, the sound a wolf makes when the world has been confirmed, when a truth held in uncertainty resolves into fact, when the pack mind says yes, this happened, this is real, we were here, we witnessed it, it is done. One by one, the other wolves joined it. Not all at once, not in a rush of collective sound, but in the way that real things spread, gradually, each voice arriving when the wolf it belonged to had finished processing what stood before them and had decided that the seeing of it warranted the full commitment of their voice. Breck joined it, and his 3 young wolves with him. The partially shifted ones at the perimeter added the register that only the between-form voices could carry, that layer neither fully animal nor fully human, living in the space between those 2 natures, which was the space the wolf-blooded had always occupied, and which this moment, more than most, belonged to. The sound rose into the pale northern sky and spread outward across the territory the way wolf voices carried in cold air, farther than seemed possible, reaching the packs at the birchwood boundary and the compressed group Breck had led, and the scattered smaller packs deeper in the territory, who had not made it to the challenge ground, but who heard the confirmation arriving now and understood what it meant. Viel stood in the centre of it and let the sound move through her. When it finally settled, she set down what she was holding and looked at the assembled wolves and said, in the same carrying voice she had used each morning in the clearing, "I am Viel of the Varek. I am not your alpha." The wolves looked at her. Duras's eyes narrowed slightly. "I did not come here to take what Gorak held," she said. "I came to end what Gorak was. Those are not the same thing. And I need every wolf on this ground to understand the difference before this day closes, because if you do not, then what happened here is only a replacement, and a replacement is not what your packs need." She let that settle before continuing. "Your packs need their alphas," she said. "Your alphas need their ground. Your ground needs boundaries agreed rather than imposed, and a way of resolving what falls between those boundaries that does not require one thing to destroy another every time there is a question." She looked across the assembled faces, taking each one in. "That is what I am offering to help build, not because I want to rule it, because it needs to exist." Duras spoke. "You killed the largest wolf this territory has ever produced," he said, and his voice carried neither admiration nor challenge. He's simply the weight of a man working through the implications of a fact. "With a spear, alone, on a challenge ground with 40 witnesses," he paused, "and you are telling us you do not want the territory. I am telling you I will not hold it the way Gorak held it," Viel said. "Alone, by force, in a way that requires everything around it to be broken in order to be held." "Then what do you want?" he said. "A council," she said. "The alphas of every pack in this territory, meeting on agreed ground, speaking to each other directly rather than through fear. And I want to be present at those meetings, not as authority above the council, but as a voice within it, a Varek voice, because my people know things about holding a settlement through hard seasons that the northern packs have not had access to, and that knowing could serve all of you." Duras was quiet for a moment. "And if the council disagrees with you?" "Then the council disagrees with me," she said. "And we work it through in words before we reach for anything else. That discipline changes the thing it is applied to, even when it does not resolve it cleanly." He looked at her for a long time with the wolf reading moving behind his eyes, and then he dropped his crossed arms. A small movement that half the wolves on the ground probably missed, but that Breck noticed, and that she noticed. And the 3 of them understood without words that something had just been agreed between them that did not need to be spoken to be binding. "The birchwood pack has lumber knowledge," Duras said, We have cut and shaped for 3 generations. When the season of new growth comes, I can send workers to the South Ridge." She looked at him and held herself steady against what moved through her chest. "That would be received with gratitude," she said. Breck spoke from the eastern edge. "The people I lead have been to the Red Rock Cliff Country in easier seasons. We know the soil and the water there." He paused. "We can help plant." Viel looked at him, and she let him see in her face what she could not yet say in words, and he understood it, and that was enough. The flat ground emptied slowly as the grey afternoon deepened, wolves returning to their territories carrying the morning with them, the weight and the fact of it, the thing they had seen that would not leave them. That would be in them when they woke the next morning and the morning after. That would change the way they moved through the territory they had been so afraid in for so long. Duras was the second to last to leave, and he stopped beside her before going, standing shoulder to shoulder rather than in front of her, which was the way that equals stood, and he looked out at the emptying ground and said without looking at her, "Your father, the South Ridge Alpha. And I heard of him from traders in easier seasons. They said he was the kind of leader the land produces rarely." She said nothing, and he said, "I think the land may have produced one more." And then he left before she could answer, which she thought was deliberate, the restraint of a man who understood that some things carry farther when they are not answered. Breck was the last. He stood before her with his exhausted eyes that were not healed but were different. I changed in some direction that had not been available to them before this morning, and he said, "What you told me when I asked what you were doing, what needs to be done. I have been thinking about it all day. And," she said, "my father lived by something similar," he said. "He never asked whether a hard thing was worth doing. He asked only whether it needed doing, and if it did, the cost of it was beside the point." He paused. "I think your people and my people should know each other when the rebuilding begins. I think there is something to learn in both directions." "I think you are right," she said. He nodded and walked into the growing dark, and she watched him go. She was alone on the flat ground with the dying fire and the cold pressing in from every side, and the pale sky above going from grey to the deep dark of a northern night. She fed the fire, not only for warmth, but because fire in the dark is a different kind of warmth, the kind the body knows from its oldest self, the part that remembers what it was to be small in a very large world and needs something burning to hold the dark back. She sat beside it and she let herself think about her father all the way, not in the careful pieces she had kept him in for 3 seasons, but whole, the complete person, in his walk and his voice and the way he listened and the way he looked at her across a fire with an expression that said, "I see you, all of you, and I am not afraid of any of it." And it was very painful, and she did not stop the pain, because stopping the pain would have meant stopping him, and she was not willing to do that, not now that the thing was done. She thought about what he would have said about today. She thought he probably would not have said much, but she thought he would have looked at her in the way he had, and she thought he might have said, quietly, that she had done well. She thought that was enough. The fire burned lower, and the wolf voices rose across the territory as the dark settled, the ordinary evening voices of packs in their places, announcing themselves to each other and to the cold, saying, "We are here, we are still here. This is our ground, and we hold it." And she listened to them for a long time. Before the fire went fully out, she rose and turned south. She had a council to build, a settlement on a red rock cliff to return to, and people waiting to be told that the shadow was gone. that the light coming in when a shadow lifts was not a comfortable light, but real light, true light, the kind you could build under. She walked south through the territory, and the wolves who watched her pass from the tree lines did not step back, but did something none of them would have done the day before, which was to turn and watch her go the way you watch something that has earned its place in the picture the land makes of itself. She walked until the south ridge appeared before her, red rock catching the thin winter light, and the people of the Varek saw her coming and gathered, and Sepha was at the front of them with her walking stick and her small dry face arranged in an expression that was so carefully not relief that it was impossible to miss what it actually was. Viel stopped before her. Sepha put one palm against her cheek briefly and then dropped her hand. "It is done," Viel said. "Then we begin," Sepha said. And they did. The old wolves still tell this story when the wind cuts cold and the fire burns low. They say the council Viel built outlasted her by generations. They say the Varek settlement became something travellers came to see, not for its size but for the quality of its living, for what it produced in the way of understanding between the wolf-blooded and the human, the understanding that spread from the red rock cliff outward, the way wolf voices spread in cold air, reaching places the speaker never imagined and finding ears that were ready to hear. And they say that in the spring following the challenge, on the flat ground where the white soil had been, something grew. One green thing pushing through the pale and lifeless earth, stubborn and ordinary and completely alive. The way life always comes back when the burning has finally stopped and the ground has been given the small, sufficient gift of being left in peace.